time to catch on with the public?
It takes time. So he starts producing them. 1836 is when this company begins. 1837, there's a big financial panic. Nobody has any money anymore. And already these guns are really more expensive than most firearms at the time. So your average person can't afford them. They'd really hoped to sell them to the United States Army, but the Army turned out not to be interested for a number of reasons. So Colt goes out of business. After being a very wealthy guy at 21, living large, I found some of his clothing receipts. I mean, he was just buying everything, started drinking a lot. He goes broke, and then he's broke for about 8 years, comes up with some other inventions. It's not until 1844 that the gun starts to come back, largely due to the efforts of the Texas Rangers, who discover the Colt revolver and realize that it's the perfect weapon to fight against the Comanche Indians, who they've been losing to fairly badly in Texas. And that kind of puts Colt on the road to riches.
Is it because they could only successfully fight them on horseback and having to use a muzzle loader just wasn't practical?
That's what it was, yes. So they would, the Rangers had guns. They had good guns, but they were all single shot guns. And even if they had a few of them, they were really not outgunned, obviously, but out-weaponized by the Comanche, because the Comanche were on horseback, Mustangs. They could travel at about 20 or 30 miles an hour, and they could fire arrows at a rate of 20 or 30 a minute.
Wow.
So reloading was a real problem. What the Indians would do was obvious. They would wait for the Rangers to fire, and then they would swoop in. And the Rangers would end up as pincushions by the time they reloaded. So it was an enormous change in the Rangers' lives when they had this weapon where they could return multiple fire. So they were the first, and then it was particularly a Texas Ranger named Sam Walker, who ended up in the Mexican War and became one of the early war heroes through a series of daring exploits. And he and Colt then team up in 1847, and they reinvent the revolver, make it much bigger, much more powerful. And that gun was sort of the beginning of Colt's fortunes, became very well known. The Army bought 1,000 of them. And after that, it was kind of off to the races because, of course, the United States was off to the races, too, heading west across the country to go get gold and other things.
These days, there's a lot of different streaming services out there. But something that a lot of them don't have is access to a whole universe of entertainment that you're probably missing out on if you're in the United States. And that's British TV. That's why it's time to burst the domestic bubble and check out Acorn TV. Acorn TV is a commercial-free streaming service that's rooted in British television. It's home to sophisticated storytelling with top-rated historical dramas, mysteries, and comedies. Acorn TV has content from Britain, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. If you're a fan of British comedy, then you should check out the other one. It follows two sisters from different worlds who have no idea the other existed until their father drops dead. If you're a fan of Downton Abbey, the other one features Siobhan Finneran. Acorn TV has thousands of hours of binge-worthy content. Historical drama I like is I, Claudius, which tracks the history of the Roman Empire from Augustus through Claudius and stars Derek Jacobi, Patrick Stewart, John Hurt, and others. You can stream Acorn TV on all your favorite devices for just $5.99 a month. Escape to Britain and beyond without leaving your seat. Try Acorn TV for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and use my promo code UNPLUGGED. That's acorn.tv, code UNPLUGGED, to get your first 30 days free. I'd like to zoom out for a second and talk about the, world historical significance of the revolver. Because when you mentioned that a Comanche could fire 20 arrows a minute, if you or I have done archery, in my case, I think the first time I did it was at Boy Scout camp. You're trying to knock the arrow. It's a very slow process. It takes 15 or 20 seconds just to set it up, and then you're shifting around for 15 seconds and you fire. Most of us really never go beyond that stage when we do archery. But for those who do it from a very young age and are proficient, like you said, what they can do is far superior to a firearm. And even though gunpowder goes to the 15th or 16th century, it's great in large armies and in large group formations and columns like Napoleon would do. But a one-on-one fight versus a bow and arrow seems like it's still a superior weapon well into the 19th century until the revolver finally seems to go over the bow and arrow technology that's been around since the Neolithic period, or probably even way before that. So what are some examples of, I guess, world historical significance where a firearm is finally superior to a bow and arrow in settings like what the Texas Rangers and others would be facing?
Well, it's always an event where you have a few people fighting a lot of people. I mean, as you said, in armies, they get a multi-shot effect by using ranks and files and using, what's known as the countermarch. The first line fires and they retire to reload. The next line fires. You almost get a machine gun effect. You get rolling fire. Of course, the problem with that machine is that the cogs in it are the human beings who have to die.
Mm-hmm.
It was very easy to kill them. It only becomes a problem when you are meeting a larger force that can fire more rapidly than you can. So as long as it was armies against armies, single shot weapons were fine. And that is, in fact, why it took so long for the American army to adopt the revolver. They really had no reason to go to a multi-shot firearm. In fact, they thought it was going to waste ammunition. They thought it would be poor for discipline. In a way, if you think about armies, the entire code of conduct, the entire army discipline is based on single shot weapons. It's about lining up, firing in sync, retiring in sync, doing everything on command. William of Orange had he broke it down to like 47 different commands that these guys would do. So this required total discipline in an army. I think a lot of the discipline of armies comes out of single shot firearms. And the army knew that, and they thought, you start giving these guys multi-shot arms, they're going to start going crazy. And in fact, that is kind of what happened when the U.S. cavalry got them. A lot of the massacres that happened against American Indians later on were the result, partly, of cavalry swooping in with revolvers and just firing away without really taking any heed of what they were doing.
Yeah, I would imagine that'd be shocking to American Indians. They have these tactics that are highly successful. If they're based on opponents with single-shot weapons, then as long as you avoid that shot, you can go in and fire multiple volleys at them and they can't fight back. And same thing with Civil War. I mean, part of the reason that conflict is so deadly is because tactics are still being used that date back to single-shot weapons, and that is not the case anymore. And then you have rifles that are accurate much further than muskets. But, well, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but returning back to Colt. Okay, so tell me the story of how Colt is showman, now that he has the U.S. Army and others who are interested in what he has to sell. How does he team up with Walker, and how does he go out and hawk his product?
Yeah, so as I said, Colt had sort of gone into a dark period in his life that went on for a number of years. He was living in New York City. His gun was basically dormant, and he knew the patent was going to run out, as the years ticked by. He spent his time working on something called the submarine battery, which he wanted to be a naval defense system for harbor safety. Basically, was to blow up enemy ships using underwater mines that would be controlled by electricity. Worked with Samuel Morse, the inventor of the magnetic telegraph, to do this. Meanwhile, I have to say, his extraordinary thing that happened in his life is his brother John is convicted of one of the most heinous and infamous crimes of the 19th century. He kills a guy with an axe on Chambers Street in New York City. Then he trusses up the body, puts it in a pine box, and tries to ship it away out of town. But the ship doesn't sail. It starts to stink. He's discovered. So the name Colt is infamous by the time Colt sort of gets back in the gun business. But it turns out infamy may not be a bad thing for a gun manufacturer. The Mexican War comes along. Colt's kind of given up on the revolver. But as I said, this guy, Sam Walker, and fellow Texas Rangers, they go to the Mexican War. They use the revolver to great effect. And then Walker is named the captain in the U.S. Army. He comes to Washington, D.C. Colt catches wind of the fact that Walker's there and says, let's meet. Walker comes to New York, and together they, as I said, they don't really reinvent. It's the same model, but they vastly expand it. Walker wanted a gun that would be very powerful. powerful enough to kill a horse. The gun they came up with was 15 inches long, 9-inch barrel, weighed almost 5 pounds, and could just pack a wallop. This gun then gets into the Army, buys 1,000 of it, and then they order another 1,000. Meanwhile, Sam Walker gets killed in the Mexican War. So Colt alone now goes forward, and he starts having orders from the Army and opens up his first factory in Hartford in the late 1840s. And then history just, he'd had a lot of bad luck for a while. All of his luck turns good now, because think of what's happening in the United States in the mid to late 1840s. The term manifest destiny is coined in 1845. You start the great immigration in 1846, going out to Oregon and California, all the great stories of the Trail West. Gold is discovered in California in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, just before gold is discovered, is signed, giving the United States enormous amounts of Western land. California, Nevada, parts of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. So the country's almost a third larger, and Easterners are just flooding west to get there. And the one thing they all want is a Colt revolver. So Colt is really off to the races at this point.
Colt was a bit of a swindler in his younger days, Dr. Colt, when he's selling his nitrous. And it sounds like he's also getting involved in questionable activities as a businessman. Does that come during this time, or does it come later?
It's pretty continuous. He does what he has to do. I mean, one of the most amazing, bold, if not, baldly venal things he did was bribe congressmen to get his patent extended. His original patent was 14 years, expired in 1850. He did get a 7-year extension, so it would last until 1857, but he wanted it because other people were trying to make revolvers by this point. So he came up with something he and his lawyer called contingent fees. They wouldn't go and outright bribe the congressman. They would say to the congressman, if you vote for this and it passes, you will get X amount of money. Well, that's bribery. When the House of Representatives caught wind of this, that many of their members were in fact taking these contingent fees from Colt, they called Sam Colt to the House to testify. And Colt, being Colt, showed up drunk at the test. And I mean, but this is what Colt did. He had, the kind of a contempt for other people's ways of doing things. Now, I'm making it sound like he was all bad. He wasn't all bad. Many people who knew him thought he was a very kind, generous, decent fellow, and he was that as well. But he was extraordinarily competitive and, audacious, disruptive. I think like many entrepreneurs, you named a few of these earlier, he came in, saw the world a certain way and thought, I don't have to do it that way. Let's change the rules.
Mm-hmm. And you say that he may have taken credit for an invention that wasn't his own. Was this another type of firearm or something different?
Well, this was what many of his competitors claimed, that in fact he knew of previous attempts to make revolvers. And the case most often cited is a Boston gunmaker named Elijah Collier, who did manage to sell some similar types of guns to the British Army well before Colt invented his revolver. Some of these supposedly made it to Calcutta, where Colt went when he was 16 years old. So the theory is he saw some of these guns in Calcutta and then came back and said, hey, look what I just invented. The thing is, though, that Colt really, when he patented his gun, he wasn't claiming that he was the first guy who ever came up with a revolving cylinder. What he really came up with was a way to revolve the cylinder and to make it lock firmly in place with the barrel of the gun so that you could fire safely. The Collier guns, you had to turn the cylinder by hand. So it was a two-handed weapon, which kind of defeated the whole purpose of a revolver. I mean, what made a revolver so effective was you, as a cavalry instrument, particularly, is you could ride the horse with one hand and shoot with the other. Having to use two hands made it not much more effective than a rifle or carbine. So Colt he claimed he never saw a Collier gun. He claimed he never knew of revolving cylinders. It's plausible because all these other efforts failed. But even if he did, he still came up with new ways to do it.
Well, most of us wouldn't appear before Congress drunk, but that's part of his personality, I guess. So are there any other stories of Colt's life that really stick out to you?